Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that the House commemorate the anniversary of the national apology to the survivors and victims of institutional child sexual abuse. Mr Speaker, 2 years ago today, this Parliament, on behalf of all Australians, apologised unreservedly to the victims and survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. It's a day that I will never forget. I'm sure it is a day that all the members of this chamber will never forget, and the then Leader of the Opposition also, who joined with me in that important apology, will never forget, and nor should we. The Parliament was full of Australians from all walks of life. Some of those in this place also as members who know only too personally of these matters. All here to reclaim a part of their life or to honour a loved one who could not be with us. Through an action as gentle and as powerful as an apology, we confronted generations of suffering. Their stories, strength, courage and presence allowed us to confront some terrible truths. That for generations our country chose silence over truth, the powerful over the vulnerable, and the reputations of institutions over the safety of children. On that day, we apologised for the pain, for the suffering, the trauma inflicted upon victims and survivors. We apologised to their children and parents, to their siblings and their families, to those who've shared their experiences and for those whose pain is still too searing to share and sadly may forever be. As I said on that day, as a nation we confront our failure to listen, to believe and to provide justice. Our apology didn't and can't undo our shared failures, nor did it return lost childhoods or bring back those no longer with us. But I earnestly hope it provided some small leisure, some moment of solace to all those who suffered and continue to, and affirmed a national determination to never let those times be repeated. Mr Speaker, prior to the apology, I, along with many others, met with members of the Survivors Reference Group who said an apology without actions is just a piece of paper, and that is right. Today I will honour that sentiment and once again report further on our actions. The foundation of our response are the findings of the Royal Commission. Of the Royal Commission's 409 recommendations, 206 are directed wholly or partially at the Australian Government. 84 were about redress and led to the establishment of the National Redress Scheme, now in its third year. Of the other 122 recommendations, 45 have been fully implemented and 76 continue to be in progress, and only one is still to be implemented. The Government continues to work with states and territories on another 56 endorsed joint recommendations, and we are playing a role in more than 50 additional recommendations that are primarily directed at the states and the territories. Our first annual progress report was tabled in December 2018 and the second last December, and the third will be done by year's end. The National Office for Child Safety has once again invited a range of non-government institutions to provide a report on their actions to keep children safe. 69 institutions have been invited this year, an increase on the 53 in 2019 and 11 in 2018. The National Redress Scheme is now in its third year. It continues to support victims and survivors with the support they need. I can report that the latest figures show that 8,297 applications have been received. Of those, 4,670 decisions have been made, This includes 3,826 payments with an average redress payment of around $82,000. This is a rapid increase on the 600 payments that I reported last year. I said then that this wasn't good enough. It wasn't, and we still have more work to do. This was why Minister Ruston announced a further investment of $11.7 million in the scheme, and we're now in the process of reviewing the scheme with an additional $104.6 million to be invested over the next 4 years. This will ensure that the scheme can meet victims' and survivors' needs. It will ensure that redress support services continue, and it will allow us to finalise the onboarding process for the 158 institutions that have committed to join the scheme to be completed by the end of the year. The Royal Commission, the apology and these yearly reports are about accountability, bringing the truth into the light. So I'm reporting that on 1 July this year, 6 institutions were named as having failed to declare their intention to join the scheme. Since then, 2 of these have joined. We still have, reprehensibly, 4 institutions who have been named publicly and who have blatantly refused to join the redress scheme. They are Jehovah's Witnesses, Kenja Communication, Lakes Entris Pony Club Incorporated, Fairbridge Restored Limited. It's not acceptable. We are currently finalising the further sanctions, I know, that are supported by the opposition, that the Commonwealth will place on institutions who continue to refuse to join the scheme, including withdrawal of their charitable status for these offending organisations. Mr Speaker, one of these areas that the Royal Commission recommended the federal, state and territory governments work together on was on a national strategy to prevent child sexual abuse. Unfortunately, progress to finalise the strategy has been significantly impacted by the pandemic. I know this is deeply disappointing for everyone involved, including the government. But let me reassure the House the government will deliver this strategy, and we are now expected to be finalised in 2021. Mr Speaker, the pandemic has seen the National Office for Child Safety redirect its efforts over the past several months. It is focused on supporting organisations, sharing resources with states and territories, and progressing policy work within the Commonwealth. Efforts continue on implementing the Commonwealth Child Safe Framework. This framework sets minimum standards for child-safe culture and practices within Australian government entities. New resources are also being developed to help children and young people understand that they can speak up when they feel unsafe, and how. This work is being spearheaded by the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Western Australia, with funding from the National Office, and will be available in December. Other resources are also in the works, including supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and communities to implement the national principles for child-safe organisations, and in a way that is culturally safe and relevant. I am also pleased to announce that additional investment is being made to expand the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. Now, this is the first national study of its kind, and it looks into the prevalence and health impacts of all forms of child maltreatment in Australia. The results will be released from September 2023 and will help guide Australia's child safety policy priorities in the years that follow and well into the future. It will be a key tool. Mr Speaker, last year I quoted a survivor who said, "Let our voice echo." My response was, "May it ever be so." My government's commitment to this, to ensuring the voices of victims and survivors are remembered and heard, will be enshrined in permanent form with a national memorial. The memorial will be built here in our nation's capital. The budget allocated funding for the memorial and is expected to be completed in 2022. Mr Speaker, our actions are not only about the past, but protecting Australian children now and into the future. The safety of our children is all of our first priorities. That's why in the past year we have strengthened our laws to reflect this. We've introduced a range of new offences. We've increased maximum penalties. We've introduced mandatory minimum sentences for the most serious and repeat offences. We've also made it easier for agencies to investigate and prosecute child sexual abuse. We've created offences for Commonwealth officers who fail to protect children under their care, supervision or authority. As well, we've put more resources into responding to reports of child sexual abuse and are working closely with our international partners to make sure the digital industry plays its part protecting children online. I acknowledge the work of Australia's E-Safety Commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, and her efforts in schools and universities working with young people, with those institutions, helping keep our young people safe. I can report we're on track to launch the National Centre for the National Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse next year. The centre will put a national lens on improving outcomes for victims and survivors, reducing stigma, raising awareness and understanding, and of course preventing child sexual abuse. Mr. Speaker, I said 2 years ago, we can never promise a world where there are no abusers, but we can promise a country where we commit to hear and believe our children. That is what we reaffirm again today, together. This is our shared and constant responsibility, together. A responsibility I know in this place we are all determined to meet.
The question is that the motion moved by the Prime Minister be agreed to, and I call the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Childhood should be the haven of some of our most wonderful memories, a time when the world was filled with the brightest sunshine, when the future was exciting and every dream felt like it one day come true. But for so many of our fellow Australians, when they look back at their childhood, that's not what they remember. Instead of sunshine, there were shadows. In the places that they should have been safe, they weren't. Instead, there was fear, betrayal, shame. The destruction of innocence of a child is an evil thing. Trust was shattered. Institutions that should have been the cornerstones of our society were instead the rot at the heart of it. And for many who suffered, the future looked impossible. So many took their own lives and never saw this debate and the change that's happened with recognition across the board by our society about the evil that was perpetrated. The daily reality for too many children was a society that wouldn't believe them, a society which forced its own shame onto the shoulders of those it refused to hear. That finally changed with the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. I'm very proud to have been a member of the Cabinet that made that decision. A Royal Commission set in train by Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who has a lot to be proud of in her period as Prime Minister, but no decision as gutsy as that one. Because there was considerable opposition to it. The courage of the survivors who gave their testimonies has not lost any of its power to humble us. 17,000 survivors came forward. 17,000 to smash the conspiracies of cruelty that had tried for so long to silence them. 8,000 shared their stories, many for the first time. I last year got asked to go to dinner with a friend I went to university with. I didn't know. He'd never spoken about his personal experience. And he wept over dinner as he accounted the difference that it made to his life. in giving evidence, not just through that process, but through the courts system to achieve justice for a childhood taken away from him, in his case, by the Boy Scouts. More than 1,000 gave written accounts. Once again, I want to acknowledge the great leadership shown by Leonie Sheedy from Clan. She made her presence felt. She demanded that those in power use their power to make a difference. She travelled the country urging survivors to speak up. Then she told her own story. What happened right across the country was a dam burst of truth. Survivors spoke for themselves and for those who couldn't yet raise their voices, and they smashed into that corrosive culture of concealment. That culture which routinely gave credence was given routinely to the abusers over the abused, which meant that those who should have protected abused children, instead they doubted, shamed and silenced them. On this day, 2 years ago, we reached the culmination of that Royal Commission. We gathered in this place and heard the Prime Minister and my predecessor, Bill Shorten, say the words that so badly needed to be said, the words that so desperately needed to be heard. Of course, an apology could never repair all the pain. It could never undo the suffering of a life darkened by a childhood lived under the shadow of violence and fear. It couldn't bring back those worn down by the weight of a truth they'd had to bear alone and did not live to hear the words, "We believe you." But the apology did mark the end of one era and the beginning of a more hopeful one. And the Prime Minister today has outlined the progress that has been made and recommitted the Parliament as a whole to do better, which we need to do. Here in this place, though, we finally extended a hand to the survivors and to the memories of the victims. And it is a very good thing that we will have the National Memorial in this, our national capital, in 2022. As I said last year, the fact that survivors accepted that belatedly extended hand will stand forever as an act of grace. We thank them. It took an inner strength that most of us can never understand. The testimonies that survivors gave to the Royal Commission are online. When the truth is right in front of us, there is no reason for us to ever again become a society that chooses to look away. When the Royal Commission handed down its report, that certainly wasn't the end of it, nor did it draw to a close with the apology. This is a process that goes on. The National Office for Child Safety continues its work in implementing the recommendations of the Royal Commission. The National Redress Scheme must continue to hold institutions to account and offer support to survivors. And we in this Parliament will take the action that the Prime Minister has suggested against those institutions that can't show just a little bit of decency in responding and joining that scheme. So we stand ready to work with the government to get the scheme working as it should, to deliver survivors the redress they deserve in accordance with the recommendations of the Royal Commission. And each year we will join here in Parliament and reaffirm the apology and everything with which it is imbued, because we cannot allow ourselves the false comfort of considering the job done and then letting it fade from memory. We will always hold in our hearts those who didn't live to hear the words, "We hear you, we believe you." And to the survivors, the gracious, patient survivors, I say this: after all those years in which you suffered beneath stifling layers of silence, we will not leave you to recede into the quiet once more. May the past 2 years have brought you somewhat closer to the peace that you deserve, and may some of that long-lost sunshine find you and warm you at last. Yeah.